Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And I'm pleased once again to welcome a truly international audience. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our special guest, Howard Jacobson. I'll introduce Howard in just a moment. Please do ask questions. This is possible by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as ever, we will try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Can I also draw your attention to the chat facility? This can be used to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, this event is being recorded and it will appear on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. There you'll find recordings of other past events and details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Howard Jacobson is a British novelist and journalist. He's the author of 16 novels and 5 works of non-fiction. He's won the Bollinger Everyman Wodehouse Prize twice and was winner of the Man Booker Prize in 2010, being shortlisted for the prize again in 2014. Born in Manchester, Howard studied English at Downing College, Cambridge. His latest book, very appropriate for this Mothering Sunday, is called Mother's Boy, and that's what we'll be discussing this evening. It's a pleasure to welcome Howard back to Milim after some 5 years. Good evening, Howard. Welcome to Milim. Really good to have you with us.
It's very, very good to be here. I can't believe it's 5 years already. It seems like a minute ago that I was there. Thank you for having me back.
Now, having entertained us with your many novels and factual works, what made you want to write a memoir and why now?
I'm not sure that I ever meant to write it. It just, as with many of my books, it just seemed to find itself being written. That's not all that fanciful because I just do play around with sentences and see what happens. But I did find myself revisiting various things that I had fictionalized in the past. A lot of my novels are sort of autobiographical, though I wouldn't allow anybody else to say that, but I can admit it now. And I was thinking, is there another way of doing some of those things? Making it more honest, or going into some of those events more, or would I even be making it more dishonest? It's not as unlike writing fiction as some people would think, which isn't to say the story I tell I have made up, but when you're remembering things from more than 70 years ago, you take some license with your memory and you never know whether you're remembering when you last told that story or your mother told you that story, and stuff like that interested me. That idea of recapturing, retelling, recreating, finding truth that might not be truth. So it's as playful as a novel is, really. And once I got caught up in writing that, I thought it'd be very interesting to see how far I can go with this.
Did the process of writing the book differ in any way to how you might approach writing a novel?
It was harder because although it was, as I've just said, sometimes as fanciful, and sometimes you wondered if you were taking as much liberty with fact, but then what fact? Who can say what fact is? Among the things that made it harder was a sense when I was writing this that I owed an obligation to everybody I'd ever met to put them in it. And then I discovered very quickly that I could get to about the first 2 years of my life and I'd written 700 pages. And I showed this to my wife and she said, I think you could thin this out a little bit. So then I had to sort of shed people. And every time I shed somebody, I thought, I can't do that. That's not fair. So there was a kind of guilt, not unlike this is a novel about guilt. I almost called it guilt at one point. Because it's about not to make amends, but to admit that one's done some awfully bad things that one's felt guilty about. But the trouble is, you then there's a double guilt. There's the guilt for the things that you did when you lived your life, and then there's the guilt because you're not having to talk about, not being allowed to talk about people. So I was actually racked on a bed of double guilt when I was writing this, which sounds uncomfortable. And I don't know whether it's uncomfortable for people to read, but it seems not. But it was quite not painful to read and to write, and not uncomfortable to write, but quite difficult to write because of these different challenges. When I'm writing a book, I'm beholden to nobody. I do whatever I want to do. Although in many ways, a memoir should not be all that different. It is different because you are mentioning real people, and to them you owe an obligation of sorts.
Now, you didn't call the book Guilt, you called it Mother's Boy. Tell us something about the title.
Well, it was going to be called Guilt, and then it was going to be called Shame Junkie, because a lot of it's about shame. And I wondered really whether I've rather liked being ashamed of this, that, and the other, more or less all my life. And then I was going to call it New, just kind of new, as it were, anticipating a reader's response. When's something going to happen in this damn book? New. And then I thought, no, that will restrict the readership a bit. And then I thought of calling it My Life as My Mother, which I rather liked actually, but my publishers didn't. But Mother's Boy is the best title for it, because it is the story of somebody who was and remains. Actually, my mother died a couple of years ago, but I'm very attached to the memory of my mother. I was a mother's boy in that I spoke like her, in the sense that I inherited a lot of her views. She was an impatient, intolerant woman about lots of things, and I'm an impatient, intolerant man. She read to me the things that she read, I still remember. And I was in a kind of league with my mother, not against my father, but in contradiction to my father. My father was a very public, open, jolly man who liked having a good time, and my mother withdrew, and I withdrew with her. So in any simcha, any big family get-together, my father's family were all out there dancing like Cossacks. My father liked to dance the Kazatsky in his dinner suit with the buttons bursting off his dinner suit. His sisters would be leading a conga out into the streets of Cheetham Hill Road, and I'd be sitting in a corner with my mother's family looking on, thinking this is no way to behave. My father was an extrovert, my mother was an introvert, and I was caught between them. Like my mother, a version of my mother, but all along wanting to be my father.
And your grandparents, you also write a lot about your grandparents. How were they involved in your upbringing?
My mother's mother, Andy, as I called her, who I adored, brought me up. The women in my family, I was brought up by women for the first 4 years of my life. My mother, who was young, probably wasn't even 20 when I was born. Her sister, who was a teenager, and her mother, who wouldn't have been very old either. And these women thought I was the most wonderful thing they'd ever seen. I was the most wonderful thing they'd ever seen. And they worshipped me and showered me with praise and gifts, but it was the praise that counted. And my grandmother was foremost in this. And if I had a falling out with my family, as I occasionally did with my father sometimes, I would run away from home. And I would run to my granny. She only lived down the street, and she would protect me. And my granny's house was a haven. It also had a little bit more religion in it. My house had no, although we all knew we were Jewish, it had no religion in it at all. My granny's house had a few kind of China rabbis and a few holy books scattered around. And there was a sense of something more of the old Jewish world about my grandmother's house, which I liked very much. Because although I was not myself, never have been a practicing Jew, I like to be quite near Jews who practice a little bit, not too much, but a little bit themselves. And I got a whiff of the old sanctity from my grandmother's house. But also she loved me and she cared for me, and she took me shopping with her, and we went to buy because we lived in Jewish Manchester, Cheetham Hill Road. It could have been a shtetl in the Pale of Settlement. Could have been a shtetl in Lithuania, which is where that side of the family came from. And we bought, and I went with my granny to buy kosher chickens and to hear, and she taught Yiddish to the shopkeepers. So I was in an old Jewish world in a way with my grandmother, and I loved it. She was very protective of me. But she was also very fatalistic. And she would always say, if anything went wrong, the Almighty will fix it. And that was at once for the first few years of my life, comforting, and then sort of frightening, really. It felt sort of pessimistic, that there was nothing we could, all our job in life was just to wait for the Almighty either to strike or not to strike. And really, I watched her not have much of a life, in truth. She was one of those women of that generation and class who, if you bought her a present, would never use it. So when she died, all the gifts we'd ever bought her were found in the drawers, all the folded blouses, all the skirts, anything personal for her, as though everything was too good for her. She was self-effacing and humble in a way, and I suppose superstitious, and very much in that way of an old world, comforting and yet also saddening.
You describe how families like yours are not part of Manchester anymore. Is this something we should be sorry about?
Yes, I loved that. I didn't know I loved it at the time, but I am an utterly nostalgic man, and I miss things the minute they've happened. I will say to my wife, "Oh, do you remember that time we spent? Do you remember what that day was like? And it was wonderful, and this happened and that happened." She said, "Of course I remember it. It was yesterday." I idealized the past immediately. I turned a moment ago into a golden past. So I turned the Manchester of the late 1940s and 50s, in which the Jewish Manchester of that period in which I grew up, into a golden past. Jewishness was worn lightly. Some families knew a little bit more about what was going on than ours did. Some spent more time in the synagogue than ours did. But by and large, there was no real ultra-orthodoxy, except for a couple of streets in Salford, which my father used to drive us down to take a look. These are the Frommers. It wasn't insulting about them. This is what From people look like. I think he felt I should know what the antecedents, that we weren't always as unrecognizable from other Mancunians. So we saw them, and I thought, well, that's a strange way of being, but okay. That's what Jewishness once looked like, or still is like for other people. And I'm glad it's not like that for us. We were secular. We were of the world that we lived in, sometimes a little bit frightened of it, but not. And the encouragement was always to go out there, live a modern life, go to school, be English. The books that my mother read, my mother was the reader, my father wasn't. The books my mother read were English novels, contemporary English novels by English novelists. She read me English poetry, Victorian poetry. She read me Wordsworth and Matthew Arnold and Tennyson. So she helped steep me, even before school did, in English culture. English culture was alive and well in our house. Where she got it from is a puzzle to me. Because she left school at 14, but I've just been looking at some of her diaries, and it's interesting. She talks about visiting reference libraries and how much she loved reference libraries. She educated herself as other people did. There was no internet to ruin people's lives and to make a laughing stock of what we could once call culture. She was free to form her own ideas, and yet she tuned in of her own volition to some of the best thoughts that were available in the country at the time. She was an utterly emancipated woman in that sense.
What do you remember of your school days in Manchester?
Well, I had good friends. I had good Jewish friends. I had good non-Jewish friends. Went to Stan Grammar School, not Manchester Grammar, as it happened. Went to Stan Grammar, which was a grammar in North Manchester, up in Whitefield Press, which is where the Jews went on their march, the great march north, the great escape from the inner city poverty of Salford and Cheetham Hill and Red Bank and places like that. And my family moved north to Prestwich, and Stan was one of the good grammar schools there, 20% Jewish kids. We were a little bit alienated from the school. School began every morning with prayers and school assembly, to which the Jews were not invited, or to which maybe, I don't know how it happened, the Jews had disinvited themselves long before I got there. But we trooped upstairs to a little room where a hopeless Hebrew teacher didn't teach us any Hebrew and didn't teach us any Bible and couldn't keep us quiet. And every now and then the headmaster would shout from downstairs, "Would the Jewish boys show some manners and shut up?" So that created a certain division between the rest of the 80% non-Jewish, 20% Jewish. Created a division between us. And then after the hymn singing, from which we were excluded, and which gave me a sense of rather melancholy alienation, actually. I'd like to have sung some of those songs. I'd like to have been part of that, but we weren't. And then we trooped out onto the balcony, and all the 800 non-Jewish boys looked up at us as though at some felons. And the minute the headmaster would go through the various crimes that the school had committed, the thieving of toilet rolls and the defacing of and the stealing of bicycles. And although they were all things that Jewish boys wouldn't do because we didn't want bicycles, and we certainly didn't like school toilet rolls, and we didn't write on walls, we took writing too seriously for that. Nonetheless, we felt guilty because 800 people looked up. So I would stand there with a burning face, knowing that they knew that I'd done all these things. And I suffered those agonies, paroxysms of guilt for the 7 or 8 years I was at school, but got through and was made a prefect, and one of my best friends, Jewish boy, was made head boy. So we were integrated in the school. There was 1 or 2 incidents. We did not get on very well with the gym teacher, who thought Jewish boys were hopeless at gym. It wasn't that we were hopeless at gym, it was that we didn't want to do gym. We didn't like it. It is instructed in various books in the Bible, in Numbers and Deuteronomy, I can't cite the exact chapters now, that Jewish men shall not swing on ropes or hang upside down from war bars. No Jewish man shall ever allow his brains to be lower than his feet. Deuteronomy 17:8, I think it is. And he didn't like that, our gym teacher, and passed 1 or 2 comments, and there was a sort of half merry war between him and the Jewish boys that went on the whole time I was there. Was it anti-Semitism? Tiny bit. Tell you what I remember most that I liked about it, that my Jewish friends and I, we used the word anti-Semitism as a kind of joke word against ourselves. If anything went wrong, we'd go, "Oh, we're making fun of our parents. Oh, it must be anti-Semitism." If you failed to win the Hebrew prize, it must be anti-Semitism. Because I suppose we could afford to make the joke because there was no real instance of it. The only real instance, troubling instance of it, was Oswald Mosley, who mainly was spending time in London, and every now and then he'd have a meeting and my father would go down, and I record this in my memoir, how at one time he attacked Oswald Mosley and missed Oswald Mosley. He broke through the police cordon, my father, very strong man, from a Ukrainian Jew with Cossacks' shoulders. He broke through the policeman, got to within a few feet of Mosley, aimed a punch, Mosley dodged, and my father hit the horse. And he didn't want to do that, but he hit the horse. Whether the horse went down, I can't remember. In some version of this story, the horse goes down. In others, if I feel people are animal loving, I don't know how you all are in Leeds, so I'll say in Leeds, I can't remember whether the horse went down or not. But it was on television anyway, and there was my dad causing mayhem on television. My mother had to go down and bail him out of a police station in southeast London. But that was it. That was our only fight with the anti-Semitic powers.
Now, one of our viewers, Jay Prosser, who has just said you should go on tour as a stand-up comic. This is very funny. I wanted to ask you about writing comedy, writing humor. Does it just flow as a stream of consciousness, or is there more of a science to what is funny and what is not funny? And I suppose, to what extent are your books planned before you write them?
They're not planned at all before I write them, at all. But that doesn't mean that they aren't very heavily worked. I wouldn't call it a science. The art of comedy, of comic writing, isn't a science, but it is certainly an art. And for me, the funnier the passages that I write, the more work I'm likely to have done on them. Because for me, comic writing is not about something funny having happened. It's not about someone falling over. It's not about banana skin. For me, the comedy happens in language. It's how you use the words. It's how you, there's the poetry of comedy writing, just as there is a poetry of sentiment and tragedy and feeling. And it's the cadence. It's change where one word is in a sentence and it's suddenly not funny. So the work goes into somewhere I can wrinkle that out. There is a comic scene here. There is a comic sentence here, but that word will not do there. And that word will not do that. And it's an immense amount of work for which I'm not asking for any sympathy. It's a great joy to do it, but it is, there's no kind of writing, I think, and all writers who do both, who are tragic writers and comic writers, will tell you this. There is no writing that's more difficult because it's all about, it is poetry. It is all about the music. It is all about the pitch and timbre and positioning of a word or a phrase. And that's where the comedy is for me in it all. And in that way, I think it's very Jewish. I have a thing, I talk about this in my memoir. I talk about this, I've always talked about this actually, the Jews are very good at it. Why are the Jews very good at this? Because the Jews are very interested in the word, the all creating word. God spoke and we were made. We believe in language. We use language. We're very good in the disputatious professions. We speak well, but also we're very funny. When people say, why are Jews so funny? Well, it isn't because they suffer mishaps. It isn't because they fall over a lot. Jews are funny because they know that life is not funny. And the best jokes are in the face of sorrow, in the face of suffering, and in the face of the inevitability of death. We laugh partly to hold, sorry, this is getting a little macabre, but we laugh partly to as a hedge against the obscurity of dying. And Jews know about this. Well, we all know about dying, but the Jews have died quite horribly over the years.
So for you, the source of this voice is Judaism, this perhaps somewhat self-deprecating voice that you employ. Mine
is, and the story of Mother's Boy really is the story of my slow discovery of this, because I didn't know. Mm-hmm. I knew I was Jewish, but I didn't know that Jewishness was going to be important to me. Indeed, my career at school and then going to university, and this is a common story, was partly an escape from the Jewishness, the provincial Jewishness of Manchester, the everything provincial of Manchester, but particularly the Jewishness. I would go away, I would have a different kind of life, I would write differently, and my subjects would be nothing to do with the Jews of Manchester, nothing to do with that. I would write in the tradition of Jane Austen and Henry James. I would write about the English country. I would write about English country house life. I would write about the aristocracy, about whom I knew nothing and never got to know anything, even when I went to Cambridge and thought, well, I'll meet them all here. I didn't, as it happens, and didn't write for a long, long time. This is the story of the book. Why was I, who had always wanted to write and do nothing but write? From the moment I like to think when I was born, I shot into the world, or I muled and crawled into the world knowing I wanted to write. Why did it take me so long? Why was I 40 before my first book came out? And the answer that I come to find in Mother's Boy is that I was in so much of denial of who I was, what I knew of life, who the people were that I knew, what I knew of myself, and the language that I used, the colorful language I was brought up to use, which was part Yiddish, part exaggeration, part expostulation, very melodramatic language on my mother's part, very interesting made-up language, market slang and all that on my father's. And I had this rich resource, which I turned my back on. And it was only as slowly I found my way into writing, and that I realized that was my source material. Those were the riches I possessed. It was only then that I was able to write. And that was how writing as a Jew came about. I couldn't write any other way.
This book, in terms of its style of humour, for me has a lot in common with your earlier work, the Mighty Waltzer particularly, and okay, they're both set in Manchester, but or at least in part, but the manner of the humour, and I remember when you published the Act of Love, and I have a copy here that you signed for me in 2008, and I said to you, The Mighty Waltzer is the funniest book I've ever read, and you wrote here, you throw down the challenge, I throw it back. This is my funniest novel. And I felt, yeah, well, it was a funny novel, but it wasn't funny in the same way that The Mighty Waltzer was funny. This is funny in the same way that The Mighty Waltzer is funny. Do you recognize the difference in the...
Yes, I do. I absolutely do. It's partly to do with, well, The Mighty Waltzer and my first novel too, Coming From Behind, which deal with either that northern world or the northern me. I'm in those. I mean, I'm in The Mighty Waltzer. I'm in Coming From Behind. I'm in Peeping Tom too. Some of my later novels, I'm not really there in that sense. I felt I could go on writing about me, even though I found myself intensely interesting. There was no reason to believe other people would. And you can't go on writing about your story. So to a degree, it is a return to the me telling those stories. But I think it might be funnier than those books too, precisely because it admits it's me, and precisely because those books have happened, a certain amount of ground has been covered. This book moves more. This book, probably more than any book I've ever written, moves. People find it very easy to read, and I'm not always that easy to read and don't want to be. But this book had to be easy to read. It had to be friendly. It had to be immediately accessible. The jokes are the jokes that we all get. And we all get them because we've all been born, we've all been little, we've all been shy, we've all been awkward, we've all not really liked being a baby, we've all been ashamed of all the rituals of being washed and cleaned and the rest of it, all the way back to circumcision. I have a few sentences about circumcision, which I claim to remember, but I probably don't. But I like to think I do, and if I like to think I do, then I do. And because it's my peculiarity. I was peculiarly shy. I was peculiarly ashamed. I was peculiarly uncomfortable in everything that I did for all sorts of reasons. But I wasn't only peculiar. The number of reviews that have said, yes, and it's been very, very well reviewed. And the reviews remind me of the best reviews of those early books. You're quite right. People are sort of saying, this is my childhood too. And you've achieved something, and that's an honor to me and to the book. If in describing one's very peculiar, very particular, odd upbringing and consciousness, you're also describing other people's as well. That's what I've always believed. If you do one thing very particularly, you reach the universal. You don't reach the universal by offering to write universal. You write very, very particularly. And the miracle of that is people go, yes. I might not have. I felt that happened with the table tennis novel. People would say, I didn't play table tennis, but I had a mishegas. I did something which took me out every night in the freezing cold to do something. And it's the same with this book. It reaches, everybody seems to recognize that this is what it was like being a child.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly. My late mother used to read poetry to me before I went to school, and where did that come from? Well, we Jews were always outside the assembly hall. So I think these, for a certain people who grew up at a certain time in the Jewish community in this country, it's very much a universal message. But you went to Cambridge, which perhaps was unusual. Was there something specific that drew you to Leavis as a lecturer?
Yes, there was this teacher, F.R. Leavis, who was at that time the most significant English literature critic there was. Is not much read now because things have changed and the teaching and studying of English literature all for the worse, I believe. But in those days, he was the person to go to. But it was odd because people said, you've gone to Cambridge, now you've entered the establishment. But the thing was that going to study with F.R. Lewis was that the last thing I was doing was going to the establishment, because he wasn't establishment. He was as alienated from Cambridge as I was. He wasn't Jewish, but his wife was Jewish. But it wasn't a Jewish alienation. He just was out of sympathy. He was a local man. He wasn't upper middle class. He wasn't from the landed gentry. Many of the people teaching English literature when I went to Cambridge were kind of members of the aristocracy, the junior aristocracy. It was still a kind of an amateurish. He was a professional reader, and he felt outside of the culture of Cambridge. And he was preaching. If I say preaching, yes, he was a kind of preaching. He was a kind of wild-eyed preacher. He was preaching a certain kind of Englishness, which I liked. It was a stern, austere, self-conscious, well-educated Englishness that I aspired to. But what it didn't do was bring me back into the English culture. It meant that I went as an outsider. I studied with an outsider. I studied an outsider's way of reading English literature. So I remained who I was in that sense. In my nature and temperament stayed the same in Cambridge. I went in shy, I went in awkward, I went in thinking, I'm not going to do well here, and I came out feeling the same. But I don't regret that education, because I read a lot. It taught me to read, and it taught me to read with, I like to think, great discrimination and discernment. That was his thing. We had to distinguish between things. One thing was not another thing. And I loved that. I loved all that, and I've done it all my life. I did it as a teacher. I went on to teach at university very much as a Lewisite, and I think I write as a Lewisite, even though I think Lewis wouldn't have liked a word I've written.
And when you graduated, was it your intention at that time to be a writer?
Yes, but I hadn't written anything, and I had to make a living, and I was offered a job. I was offered a lectureship. It was in Australia, which alarmed my parents. Australia was a long way to go in the 1960s, and we went by boat. And when you go on a boat, it feels an even further. When you're on the boat for 5 weeks, it feels an even longer distance away. And my parents worried whether I would ever come back or not, and I had no idea what would happen. I don't know how I would be. Didn't know how I would be. As it happens, it turned out that I loved teaching. I taught at Sydney University, and I loved teaching there. Sydney University gave me the chance to be, I've said to you that although I was like my mother's boy, I was like my mother. I said what my mother said. I was shy and difficult like my mother. I wanted to be my father. When I got to Sydney University, I could be my father. My father standing on the back of his van in Liverpool Market, or in Garster, or in Worksop, going a lady over here and a lady over there, and mock auctioneering and entertaining the crowd. And I found myself doing exactly that. Only I wasn't selling bedspreads, I was selling English literature. And it was like a renaissance. No, renaissance is wrong, because a renaissance is a reborn. I hadn't been born yet. I was born for the first time when I went to Australia. I was born as my dad when I went to Australia.
But when you come back, you actually do work on a market stall.
I do, yes.
Selling handbags. Was that the same experience? Did you enjoy doing that, or was it a case of needs must? No. Needs must. I came back and was doing a little bit of teaching in Cambridge, a little bit supervising, as it was called. That's when you get to do some one-on-one teaching. I didn't like one-on-one teaching. I only liked lecturing to 700 people. Anything less than 700 people seemed a bit flat to me. So I didn't like one-on-one teaching. It didn't earn me very much money, but the markets. So I had to turn my hand to something, and I knew about the markets. So I took a stall on Cambridge Market. But finding myself in my late 20s, back on a market stall, so many years after I'd not liked helping my dad on his market stall, and had been to Cambridge and had got an education and had traveled the world and had taught at universities, suddenly to find myself back there felt like everything had come to nothing. Did I feel suicidal? I felt close to suicidal. I felt it was all over for me, really. And it was, for a little while, all over for me. It was a miracle that it wasn't actually all over for me. But you go back to Australia, you spend some time in Melbourne, which is, by what you say, very bohemian. And then you end up in Wolverhampton, which must have been a bit of a culture shock after that.
Wolverhampton was sort of like that was like an act of suicide. I needed a job. They gave me a job. I didn't have to take it. On the other hand, I did have to take it because I needed to earn some money. I found it, I won't say what it's like now, it's not fair, because in recent years, Wolverhampton moved from being a polytechnic to being a university, and it had the sense of humor and good grace to give me an honorary doctorate. So I'm not going to slag off now the town from which I hold my honorary doctorate. But I didn't like it. It was a northern provincial town, and it didn't have the vitality of Manchester. It was dismal. People spoke in an accent that didn't make you want to slit your throat. It was cold. It was rainy. I was on my own. I ate curries had good curries there. I ate curries day and night because I had nothing else to do. I lived in a horrible flat, self-punishing. I thought I'll find the worst flat that I can find, pay the least amount of money for it, and prove that my life is at an end by living as though my life is at an end. And having brought my life just about to an end, I finally found the novel that I knew I had to write. And it was a novel about a man who brought himself to the end in Wolverhampton, found himself teaching in a polytechnic, which he was ashamed of, which he shouldn't have been ashamed of, but he was, and he's a Jewish man. And a Jewish man, Jewish humiliations when life goes wrong, I'm not going to say they're worse than anybody else's, but when you're the kind of Jew I am, that somewhere or other, without not knowing really what Jewishness was about, fumbling towards Jewishness all the time, finding out a little bit more, but having that sense that that there was some purpose, that there's something about reading the Jewish books of the Bible, and that suggest you're here for a reason, to do something grand, something special. The being chosen, which many people misinterpret when we talk about the chosen people, that doesn't mean that God said you're the special ones, you're the ones who've got to be looked after, you're the elite in that sense. It simply meant make of your life something. Don't waste it. Don't waste it like whoever they are in the Lot family, they get drunk all the time. Don't do what they did in Sodom and Gomorrah. Make your life a thing of substance. And I was unable to believe that in Wolverhampton Polytechnic that my life had become a life of substance. And at that point, I thought there is a horrible black comedy in a Jew who believes his life should be one of grand purpose and substance, teaching English literature, not only in Wolverhampton Poly, but in the football ground. That was where our rooms were, in Wolverhampton Wanderers football ground, the ultimate, as I saw it, the ultimate humiliation. And out of that hell came, the road to paradise. I wrote a book.
And you describe epiphanies. You say there are 3 epiphanies which led to this novel.
Do I say that? Have I now got to remember the 3 epiphanies?
Well, I marked it in the book because I suspected.
Remind me.
So, writer campus novel, the first. Second, writer campus novel, not about a university, as was the Polytechnic. And then my third, I was already without a plot, a plan, an intention, or a hero. Why not a campus novel without a campus?
Yes. And then the Jew. Yes, that's it. The campus novel without a campus. And then the Jewish hero. I had no idea if this novel would work. It took several years to write. People said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing a splenetic book." And they would say, "About what?" And I'd say, "I'm not really sure. But all I can tell you is I think it's funny." And then it was published, and people were good enough to say some people thought this was the funniest book they'd read. Certainly a lot of people thought it was funny. There was also a lot of people don't like funny books. I think Jews like funny books, but there are a lot of non-Jews who are not sure whether a novel should be funny. Shouldn't a novel be of more solemn purpose? Well, I myself don't think there is more solemn purpose than a comedy. Comedy is not the opposite to serious. When and this a Jew knows particularly, a Jew at his most serious knows that the resource of comedy is essential to him. So I felt I was writing a comic novel about something terribly, tragically serious.
People speak of you as the English Philip Roth. What do you feel about that comparison? Because Philip Roth, his work is quite serious. It's not comedy.
It's no more serious than mine. It's
Okay.
no more serious than mine. And he can be very funny. He is very funny sometimes. He's more self-important than I am. He's very, very, very good. I mean, I think he writes some of the best sentences in contemporary English writing that there have been. I mean, I think he's a wonderful writer. But when I did at some point, and I talk about this in the memoir, when at one of the festivals, someone asked your very question. And I said, look, he's a great writer, but I don't see myself as the English Philip Roth. I see myself more as the Jewish Jane Austen, which is too clever a joke for him to have ever made. And he didn't make it. But what's meant by that joke is that my tradition is English. I didn't write Jewish novels because I'd read him or Woody Allen or Bernard Malamud or Joseph Heller. I hadn't read them, actually. I'd read very little of them before I started writing. And it was only when people said, oh, this is like Philip Roth or Saul Bellow, that I thought, well, I better find out who they are. I was writing like I wanted to be number one Dickens. Dickens was and remains my favorite writer. And then after that, George Eliot, Jane Austen, Henry James. I wanted to be like that. And I'm in that tradition. I form sentences as they form sentences. The American writers are in another tradition. So yes, I mean, it was very flattering to be compared to Philip Roth, but it's not really what I do. People made the comparison because we're both men. We are both funny. He is funny when he's good. And we both wrote about sex quite a bit. And people thought that was enough to bracket us.
Before we park Philip Roth, Dr. Malcolm Addlestone says, are you the Zuckerman of Philip Roth's so-called autobiographical novels?
No, I don't need to be a Zuckerman. No, if I'm like any character in comic writing, I'm Sefton Goldberg. I am the Sefton Goldberg of my first novel, Coming From Behind.
Now you've sort of raised your head above the parapet on more than one occasion, particularly recently with fighting against anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. What can you share about that?
Well, I don't think I've got anything to say now that hasn't already been said. I was vocal about Jeremy Corbyn. I did think Jeremy Corbyn had serious problems with Jews, and as far as I could see, didn't like Jews. The fact that he was not prepared to listen to Jews was a proof of that. The fact that he was impatient every time a Jew spoke as a Jew was another proof of that. It's funny, I had an original version of this memoir that began on the day we went to the general election in 2019, not knowing whether Corbyn was going to get in or not. And the memoir began full of dread about that. But that gave the memoir a coloration that I didn't want. And people who saw it said to me, my wife too said to me, don't bother with him. He's not important enough. He's ephemeral. He's beneath the interest of this book. He will have gone. You don't want to be remembering him. So I got rid of that. But I think he was one of the most serious threats we've faced from a political party, Jews from a political party, certainly in my lifetime. And I think the Jews of this country supporters did a very good job of showing what he was and persuading the country that he was not to be trusted or voted for. But it doesn't go away. I mean, I wrote a novel called Jay, which nearly won the Booker Prize, should have won the Booker Prize, but didn't win the Booker Prize. And Jay is the story about the everlastingness of anti-Semitism. Jay is about Jews having been expelled from a country. We don't know that they're Jews, but their name begins with a J and they look a lot like Jews. And it is a story of that ambition that won't go away to find a world without Jews. And this kind of looks at what kind of world you get when you empty the Jews of it, and examines why people want to do that. We are the eternal other. We are the eternal, for some reason, threat. It goes back a long time. It's embedded in Christianity, and Christianity is embedded in the spiritual history of of Europe and beyond Europe. And so some sort of anti-Semitism remains. Even in the most liberal countries, a little bit of anti-Semitism will always remain. And I think it does mean we have to be alert, on the lookout, not to join in, not to think it's fashionable to join in, and to recognize what it is when it's there.
You've also been a vocal supporter of Israel, which for people in the arts is perhaps an unusual stance. Has that led to any tensions with your peers?
A bit. It's led to a few, yes, it has led to a few disagreements, but you have to have disagreements. I think a lot of them think I'm peculiar for taking this position. I don't think they're peculiar. I think I find it hard to forgive their ignorance more than anything else, because more than anything else, I think what fuels this is a determination not to know what Zionism is. I don't mind anybody saying the situation in Israel is very cruel if you're a Palestinian, and it's very cruel if you're an Israeli too, because it does mean that you're not having the fuller life that you could have. It needs to get better. It's going to have to get better soon, because in the light of what else we're seeing in the world, I think there's going to be even less tolerance for anything that looks like, you know, a persecuted minority. I can understand any people expressing the utmost sympathy for the Palestinians, but politics are complex, and you can express sympathy with one side without completely denigrating another. There are situations, I think we're probably seeing one at the moment, when there's absolute evil is at work. Absolute evil is not at work in Israel. Zionism is not the horrible thing that it was. Zionism, I tell you what I would tolerate. I would tolerate somebody who came along and said this. Zionism in the 19th century had to happen. The Jewish life for Jews living in Eastern Europe was intolerable. It was pogrom after pogrom. Apart from the pogroms, they weren't living a satisfactory life. They were denied decent work, denied opportunities. Their life had to change. And this was felt by and expressed by and understood by many, many writers, civilized people who were not Jews all over Europe and indeed America. Zionism grew out of that frustration and then ultimately the despair, because not only was life not satisfactory for Jews in Europe at that time, it was dangerous. It wasn't just the Holocaust that threatened the lives of Jews. Hundreds of thousands of Jews had been dying over the previous 100 years. Something had to change. Zionism grew out of many, many causes, but many of those causes were comprehensible, even philanthropic in some instances, and necessary. Now you could say, what a shame that Zionism didn't completely work out. What a shame that Zionism took, I'm not saying this is the case, but you could say this. It is a tragedy that Zionism, for which so much was hoped, didn't manage to achieve all we wanted it to. Say that. That's fine. But say what Corbyn wanted to say, which is that Zionism was from the very, very beginning racist. And that makes you, I think, an anti-Semite, because you are refusing to understand the plight of Jews. And if you won't understand the plight of Jews, then that discredits your offering to understand the plight of the people the Jews are fighting with at the moment in Israel. So it's bad faith. So the minute I hear Zionism denigrated from the very, very start, I know I'm dealing with somebody who cannot be trusted, who hasn't read their history, or who interprets their history in a malevolent and anti-Semitic way. So as far as I'm concerned, anti-Zionism of that kind is anti-Semitic. But that doesn't mean I think it's anti-Semitic to be critical of a particular Israeli government or Israeli policies. We can draw a distinction.
Fine. Now, towards the end of the book, you speak about art being a religion. What do you mean by this?
I think art is where we go to for, just as people go to religion for a higher truth, and I've never gone to religion for a higher truth. I mistrust the higher truths of religion, but I don't mistrust the higher truths of art. And it's for this reason. In art, we find, in the making of art, we find a self that we did not know was there. When I write a novel, I don't know where that novel's going. I do not write a novel to express my views. A novelist, like a painter, like a composer, has no business having views, actually. Views are for Twitter. Opinions for Twitter, that's nothing. When you make art, you make something in contradiction to any views or opinions you might hold. Art occupies a different kind of space. You discover something in art, and not necessarily yourself. It's a cliche to say, well, I wrote to find myself. No, write to lose yourself. Write to lose the daily person that makes judgments and doesn't like this and doesn't approve of that and doesn't believe in this. Art occupies a different kind of imaginative space. The classic case, just quickly, the classic example of this that I always make, I make it in the memoir, is of Anna Karenina, that greatest of all 19th century studies of adulterous love, that was written at the beginning by a man who believed he was going to write a religious novel condemning, because he was a religious man, he was part of some Christian cult, Tolstoy, and he was going to condemn this society woman's adultery. Art gets hold of him. Art takes over from the Christian and the reformer and becomes something else. And far from it being a study of misbehavior, it becomes the most affecting and absorbing study of the destructive power of love, of what it's like to be in love, of how awful it is to lose love, of how you lose yourself when you are in love. Tolstoy, the artist, is at war in Anna Karenina with Tolstoy, the person with ideas, the ideologist, and the artist wins. You always want the artist to win. Art is richer than ideology. And the best readers read in the same way. So when a reader says, well, I didn't really like that book because I didn't find the character likable, that's rubbish. That's not why you should read. Read to lose yourself. Read to discover people who are not like you, who do not speak as you speak, who do not think what you think, who are not who you are. Come away from a book discovering a self you never knew you had. And that's what art does.
Now, the book ends with the publication of your first novel, Coming From Behind. What made you stop at that point? And in fact, we have a question from Anthony Green in Modi'in in Israel. Is there another book in the pipeline that covers subsequent years?
No, there are novels that cover subsequent years, but no, I won't write another memoir. I don't think so. It would be too difficult. That's finished. This is the story of how the story I wanted to write was the story I realized I wanted to write is the story of how I simultaneously discovered I was Jewish and liked being Jewish, and discovered how I could write and liked writing. Those two things run together, they interweave, they feed each other. After that, it's a different kind of story. I don't then want to write about this book and that book and the people I met. No, I've done, my memoir writing is done and will now, as it had in the past, take a different form.
Linda Rosen asks, have your novels been translated into other languages and have they been faithful to the original?
I'm a bad linguistician and I've never read any of my novels in other languages, so I don't know how faithful they are. Yes, different novels at different times. After the Booker Prize, my novels were published in, 20, 30 languages, and that was terrific to see them there. And even in Israel, because before that, Israel had not translated my novels. And their reason had been, and I wanted to wear this as a badge with pride, they said they did not want to translate my novels because they were too Jewish. But they translated a few. I think they've stopped again now. I think I doubt they'll translate this memoir. They'll find this far too Jewish. But some countries have been, Germany and particularly Italy. Italy, my novels go down very well in Italy. And when I go to Italy and talk at a festival there or something, I might as well be talking here to Milim or to Jewish Book Week or to the Manchester Jewish Museum. They all look like my Jewish aunties in in Italy. Italians and Jews have a lot in common, and they like it, and they get the jokes. And if anything were to go wrong here and some publishers were to say, we've had you, we don't know, we're sick of you now, I think I'd go to Italy and just write my books for Italians.
Well, that's interesting, because Percy Krause, who I'm assuming is in Israel, says, would you ever consider living in Israel?
I've never considered living in Israel. I do feel I've not spent as much time in Israel as I would like to, and I don't know why that's happened. I've been to Israel several times, but only to film, only for work, either because researching a chapter or something. Yes, I would consider living in Israel. Yes, I would. Is she offering me a house?
Well, she can put something in the chat now if she is. Now, in 1951, your school teacher, Esther Herman, wrote to your mother saying, I have every confidence that Howard will be a great writer one day. At what point did you begin to believe her?
I take writing so seriously. I am so religious about literature and novels. I don't know that I would be prepared to say yet that I am a great writer. If I see someone saying I'm a great writer, I get embarrassed and I think I might be a fraud. Great writer is great writer is Dostoevsky, it's Tolstoy, it's Dickens. Do I deserve to be one of those? I couldn't say that. Sometimes other people say that for me and I think that's the most wonderful thing, but I couldn't say that. But I believed I was a writer and could do it the minute I finished Coming From Behind. And that was when I thought, yeah, it's maybe Esther Herman. And I tell the story in the memoir, and it's very sad, that Esther Herman, in fact, died just before Coming From Behind was published. And her sister wrote to my mother and said, Esther would have been so pleased to have seen this. I mean, I'd forgotten all about Esther. She'd written that letter to my parents when I was 9, and here I was finishing this novel more than 30 years later. So I'd forgotten all about her. But my mother treasured the original letter from Esther Herman, and then the letter from her sister saying Esther would have been so proud.
Let's finish with a question from David Port. Did your mother enjoy your books?
My mother, yes. She used to say towards the end, I'd show her my new novel and her eyesight was not good, and she'd peer, she'd lift her glasses up, she'd do this. Have the book like that, she'd do this. She'd lift her glasses, not be able to see the cover, and then she'd say, take her glasses off, put the book down and say, I preferred your first book. And she always said that. She said, I preferred your first book. I thought she would not like my first book because it does make it makes a little bit of fun of Sefton Goldberg's parents who come to see him get his degree in Cambridge and behave not at all unlike the way my mother and father behaved, but they had good senses of humor and they laughed. I think she would have loved this memoir. She died while I was writing it, which was sad. I think she would have loved it. She would have got it, and she would have agreed with you that it's much more like the earlier novels. I think as the novels got denser and more complex, I don't think they're that complex, but as they got more complex anyway, I think she started to part from them. I think she loved the stuff. She loved the joke. She loved the humor. She roared with laughter at Coming From Behind, and I think she would have roared with laughter at Mother's Boy.
Well, Percy Krause has space in Jerusalem in return for workshops. What kind of workshops, she doesn't say. Howard, thank you so much for being our guest this evening. Mother's Boy is a really entertaining read. If you want to buy a copy, there's a link on our website and in the follow-up email that you'll get tomorrow. If you use that, Millen will earn a few pennies, but the book won't cost you any more. And to say thank you to you, Howard, I'm going to send you a book of some of my photographs of Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service in action. Hope you enjoy that. Now, a few words about our upcoming programme before we leave. There's no rest for us. We're back tomorrow, 28th of March. We partner with the Jewish Historical Society of England Leeds branch, and we welcome Dr. Tracy Sambells from the University of Huddersfield and the Holocaust Centre North. Chelsea is speaking about the lesser-known legacies of the Nuremberg trials. And then on the 4th of April, we have Joshua Rubenstein. He's joining us from Harvard to tell us about his book, The Last Days of Stalin. And then the following week, on the 11th of April, we welcome Pam Fox. Pam is speaking about the Jewish hotels and guest houses of Bournemouth. Please visit our website at millim.org.uk to book your tickets. All our events are free, but you can make a small donation if you wish. There is a link in the chat now, and sign up there for our newsletter to make sure you don't miss out on anything. It remains for me to thank our guest, Howard Jacobson, once again. Thank you so much, Howard.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. Thank you, Jonathan.
We have too. Looking forward to seeing you all at a future event.